He lifted the crystal punch bowl as if it were a toast, not a weapon, and smiled with the ease of a man who had practiced cruelty in private until it looked like charm in public. The liquid arced over the crowd in slow, glittering beads, champagne, lemon peel, a sheen of someone else's laughter, and found Isabella first, cold and bright against her skin. For a heartbeat, she felt only the chill sliding down her arms and the absurd weight of glass above her head. Then Marcus spoke, his voice low and clear for everyone to hear. She was never more than a stepping stone. The ballroom held its breath like a held note. Chandeliers trembled, 1,000 phones met the scene with 1,000 tiny lights. The band faltered, then kept playing as if noise could stitch dignity back together. Isabella's palm went instinctively to her belly, to the small, insistent life she carried, a small, separate heartbeat that had nothing to do with the man laughing across from her. Around them, faces tilted between consumption and amusement. Some laughed because laughter was legal and easy. Others pretended not to see because pretending costs nothing. A few turned their cameras toward their lips and then back to the screen. Their faces learned to look professional in a single motion. She remembered the coffee shop, 7 years earlier, like a photograph slid from an envelope and warmed in her hands. He'd been late. The rain had made puddles at his shoes and he had apologized with a joke, the kind of small, bright joke that felt like light. He told her he wanted a family, that he would be someone she could count on. He'd kissed the corner of her mouth and promised to worry only about what he could fix. Those were the years she kept close, years she could still smell when she closed her eyes. Inexpensive dark roast, his breath on the side of her neck, the way he said her name like a vow. Now the memory out like bait. Everything after the coffee shop had started as an extension of faith in his good humor, in his capacity to be a provider. She'd left the safety of her brother's dinner table and aunts whose hands smelled of lemon polish because Marcus had asked for a life that felt like more, a tiny flat with a view, a business plan that read like a map to somewhere greener. She thought she was choosing independence. In truth, she had been stepping onto someone else's stage. Phones multiplied, and the video threaded itself through the world. Sophie Chen, who had been standing by the hors d'oeuvres with her back to the punch, felt the scene crack open the way glass cracks and knew she could not look away. Sophie was the kind of friend who remembered birthdays and hospital rooms, and had, 2 weeks before, texted Isabella a picture of baby clothes and a little exclamation heart. Tonight she fumbled for her phone, thumbed a single number, and said something that contained both urgency and a steady calm. Call them. Now. It took 19 seconds for the Harrington brothers to appear in the doorway. That was Sophia's estimate later, when she tried to reconstruct time, because her own memory had the bluntness of a photograph blurred by motion. The doors slammed as if someone had shut the sky. Music stuttered and then sank into silence as footsteps filled the high-ceilinged room. The temperature shifted, in a way bodies feel before they articulate it, like the tiny drop in light before thunder. Aiden Harrington walked in first. He moved with the surety of someone who had been trained by consequence to hold himself small until threat required otherwise. He wore a dark suit that swallowed the ballroom lights and carried the quiet of someone who had learned to weigh words before letting them fall. He did not run. He did not shout. He closed the distance between himself and Isabella with the casual precision of someone who knew by instinct where sanctuary began. Without a question, he draped his jacket over her shoulders, the fabric heavy and warm. And in that small, immediate motion, he reclaimed what the punch had tried to erase, her dignity in front of an audience. Grayson Harrington arrived like a fact made flesh. He was the brother who kept papers, who loved spreadsheets the way other people loved novels. His face was unreadable, his jaw like a hinge locked against rage. Where Aiden brought gravity, Grayson brought geometry, angles, lists, timelines. His phone was already alive, his eyes skimmed for detail like a scanner. He moved with a legal mind's economy, collecting sightlines and witness positions in one measured pass. He smelled of aftershave and coffee and a patience that was not softness. Miles Harrington came last, and with a different kind of force. He had the charisma that made cameras like him. His influence felt like oxygen in rooms where men who thought themselves invincible breathed thinly. He smiled with the measured polish of someone who could make a headline spin into a verdict without ever stepping into a courtroom. Miles had the look of one who had lived by the axiom that attention is power and power is leverage. Where Grayson curated facts and Aiden generated calm, Miles controlled the story. They converged around Isabella as if the world had contracted to the three of them and the woman they had come to protect. For everyone watching, those on the ballroom floor, those holding their phones up, time did that strange thing where it stretched and thinned.
cameras recorded the moment their three shadows fell over hers, and the angle of light on the trio looked, when later reviewed on social media, like a painting of rescue. Marcus laughed as if nothing important had happened, as if he hadn't just tipped the bowl and turned a woman into spectacle.
Scarlett, his companion in show, who had poured the punch with a confident wrist, still wore the precise look of someone who had rehearsed all outcomes, except the one where people arriving could dismantle her plan with a look. Her hair was a study in glossy discipline. Her heels recorded the sound of arrival and retreat, the soft tick of someone who had always meant to be seen. Now her smile thinned. "Isabella," Marcus said, the word a paper-thin apology learned too late. But he did not stop. He leaned in because he liked the proximity of an audience and the angle from which humiliation shines like a spotlight. "Look at her," he called, a mockery masquerading as a revelation. She kept the truth like a dirty card up her sleeve. She was a stepping stone. The room exhaled laughter like automatic reflex. Some hands clapped. Others turned their phones to angle the frame just right. There were syllables of discomfort in the air, but those were drowned by the quicker, easier sound. Spectacle. Isabella felt a little ridiculous then, for the way her chest tightened, for the hot flush that rose not from shame, but from the raw uncovering of how naked her trust had been. She wanted to speak. She wanted to tell the hundreds of faces why she had chosen love where they saw weakness. But the words stored behind her teeth were heavy like coins. She was not yet ready to spend them. Miles reached forward before her. He did not shout. He did not demand silence with his voice. Instead, he tapped his phone twice, and a low hum traveled through the room, the first thread of a new narrative unspooling. On a screen in the banquet hall, a live feed flickered to life. For a moment, people murmured at the novelty. Then Grayson, with no showboating, swiped the feed to full and steadied his jaw. 3 million people are watching this right now, Miles said, and the number fell into the air like an accusation. The audience who had gathered to witness the spectacle became instantly a global audience. Phones stopped being mere appendages and became megaphones. The ballroom's private gossip had been transformed into public record. Red notification bubbles blossomed across screens like warnings. It was in that second, one of the tiny, inexorable seconds that separates a life before and after, that Isabella realized the humiliation would not simply be a closed book. The pathos of the moment, the cold splash of punch, had been translated into a medium that could carry the truth as far as these brothers' reach would allow. She felt curiously less naked and strangely more seen. The difference was small, but crucial. Sophie, outside the crush and now away from the caterers, watched the live stream with a breath she did not know she had been holding. Her call had been the match. She had texted the brothers and told them simply that Marcus had gone too far. She had included a clip of the incident and a timestamp. She had typed, "He's doing it now." And then she had watched the world respond. Aiden's hand tightened around the jacket he had draped over Isabella, as if the fabric could anchor them both to the ground. His voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of a man who meant to hurt. It was a voice that had been tempered by years of guarding and watching, and it cut through the chatter like a bell. "This ends tonight," he said. His words were small. Their consequences were not. Marcus's smile faltered. The room tried to decide whether the shift in dynamics would be interesting or dangerous. Some guests edged forward for the promise of more spectacle. Others slid away, suddenly conscious of the cameras trained on their faces. Scarlett's hand went to the phone at her clutch, as if to call for outside reinforcement that didn't exist. Her eyes flicked to Marcus with a question that needed, by then, to be answered by someone who was not orchestrating a fashion statement. Grayson had already moved into the background of the scene with the economy of someone arranging chess pieces. He tapped, scrolled, opened a document folder on his phone, and then projected an image for the room to see. It was not merely a collection of screenshots. It was an anatomy of the life Marcus had built on illusions. There were corporate names that in the last 5 years had shed coats of respectability and revealed legal disclaimers in tiny type. There were wire transfers and shell entities, and a small list of partnerships that read suspiciously like a paper trail of promises without delivery. "These are not accusations from the floor," Grayson said, his voice exact. "These are documents. Our counsel has been looking at them for weeks." He did not shout.
He did not brandish the files like a cudgel. He handed them to the room with the procured calm of someone who trusted proof more than fury. He put the facts where spectacle had been and let them change the air. Marcus's composure, the practiced ease with which he had once redirected attention away from his failures, ruptured. He tried to retake the narrative, to turn his earlier cruelty into a demonstration of decisive masculinity. "You can't make me the bad guy," he protested, the sentence coming out thinner than he intended. "You're making a scene." A scene. A whole life she had believed in reduced to a phrase slipped into the mouths of those who wanted to minimize shame. Don't make a scene. The room had already decided what it wanted. Now it had to decide whether to follow those who discomforted the comfortable or to hide behind polite applause. Make a scene? Aiden's laugh was low and full of something like contempt. You started the scene by pouring punch on a woman who is pregnant. You chose spectacle. We're here to put truth where you left lies. Phone shifted. The live stream comments bloomed with empathy and outrage in equal measure. Some called for immediate action, others asked questions best left for a lawyer.
There were threads of cruel humor, the internet's reflexive need for commentary, but mixed with a clearer current, sympathy for the woman who had been made public property. Isabella's voice was thin when she finally spoke. It shook like a branch. Her words were not a confession or a plea. They were a small, personal truth. "I trusted him," she said. "I thought he loved me." The admission landed like a pebble and sent tiny ripples that extended beyond the ballroom's marble floors into comment sections and group chats. In those ripples, the story grew teeth. Miles, who had been watching the screen like a conductor watches an orchestra, had already started to compose the next movement. He tapped a few keys, and messages moved out into the world with machine-like precision. Contact points for journalists, a brief statement of intent to not allow the story to be obfuscated, an offer to provide documents to credible investigative reporters. His role was to make sure the narrative did not die in gossip, but became auditable, accountable. "People will say anything when they want to protect a man," he said softly, mostly to himself, and to the cameras that would turn his words into headlines. "We will make sure the record is clear." There were faces in the crowd who had been complicit, who had filmed, laughed, pointed, or simply tolerated the scene. A woman near the dessert table tried to tuck her phone away like a child hiding a scraped knee. A man in a tuxedo shifted in his seat and avoided eye contact entirely, as if looking at Isabella might transmogrify him into someone who had chosen wrong. The chorus of indifference was not monolithic. Threads of shame threaded into it. Some hands, once raised for applause, now trembled and dropped to laps. Marcus grew louder because he knew the refuge of noise. He attempted to reframe his cruelty as revelation. "She was secretive," he said. "She lied to me." The words were meant to land like blows. Instead, they felt hollow, frayed at the seams. Grayson stepped forward and did something both merciless and necessary. He read aloud a line from a contract, one of the many that tangled Marcus's accounts with the companies that had lent him credibility. The clause, printed in the small, honest type businesses use when they want to avoid scrutiny, spoke of obligations Marcus had never met, of funds that had been rerouted, of promises that had been turned into liabilities. The ballroom watched while the legal architecture of Marcus's masculinity crumbled like dry mortar. "You have been living on borrowed credibility," Grayson said, "and you used that house of cards to make people pay for things that never happened." Speech like Grayson's does two things in public. It clarifies and it coronates. It clarified to the room that the man who had been charming and well-dressed had been trading on others' trust. It coronated the brothers' authority to speak, not as vigilantes, but as people with the means to produce documentation and the will to expose it. There was a line between spectacle and accountability, and they were showing the room exactly where it ran. The first murmur of fear in Marcus's face was subtle and honest. It was the emotion betrayal creates in a manipulator when the scaffolding he relied upon is revealed to be not structural, but theatrical. He was naked, briefly, and he did not like the sensation. He reached for the safety of other people's laughter like a flailing swimmer grabs at buoyancy. "You think you can ruin me?" he asked, voice thickening into menace. "You, with your money? You think you can buy—" "Money isn't the issue here," Aiden interrupted, and the sentence had the force of a closing door. "You misused people's lives. You hurt someone who trusted you." That word, hurt, felt like an instrument of law more than a personal reproach. It was simple, precise, and impossible to obscure.
Scarlett moved then, attempting a pivot. "This is ridiculous," she said, a practiced bit of indignation. "Do you all really believe half of this? He is a good man. She is complicated." Her defense landed like a rock dropped in water. It made rings, but did not displace a stone's solidity beneath. People heard her, and then heard Grayson hand the room another file. Birth certificates, an odd marriage license in another state, a contract with a firm that specialized in obfuscation. The air between Scarlett's carefully placed words and the documents Grayson spread out on his phone condensed into an accusation. There had been a pattern, not a moment. Marcus's allies, men who had laughed with him, socialites who swapped new tabs of gossip like currency, stuttered as their own phones filled with notifications. One by one, the people who had been willing to enjoy someone else's fall began to wonder if their moral casualness would come with a cost. A few saved the stream to show to friends later. A few closed their apps and walked out. The ballroom's energy shifted from appetite to unease. Isabella watched this reconfiguration with an odd distance. She was still soaked, her hair clinging to the back of her neck, the silk of her dress puckered where the punch had gathered. Her body trembled, not from the cold of the liquid, but from the strange alchemy of shame and vindication. She realized in a small, disorienting arc of thought that she had been ashamed not simply because of what Marcus had said, but because of how easily others had let him make her shame public. The true wound lay not in the punch, but in the way people learned to invent their empathy only when a camera pointed at them. "Isabel," Miles said. Isabella's name softened in his mouth in the way family sometimes puts on a cadence of care. "You're coming with us."
It was an offer that contained layers. Safety, certainly. A removal from the immediate humiliation, and an implicit recognition that this was no place for recovery. The brothers moved like someone reassembling a living room after a storm, stacking the small comforts within reach. She accepted without ceremony. Aiden guided her to a waiting car, the jacket still over her shoulders, the warmth of human touch returning to her like a tide. Cameras caught the small, ordinary choreography of three men shepherding a woman away from spectacle into a private orbit. It felt like an act of life-saving, and she let herself be saved by it. Sophie, who had been the match that set the brothers in motion, watched them go and felt, suddenly, the all-too-familiar ache of being the mediator between family and crisis. She knew the network she had interrupted was fragile, a lattice of obligations and unspoken debts, and that the Harringtons' entrance had not simply ended the night so much as initiated a new chronology. This was now a story that would live beyond the rooms where it began. Outside, in the cool air near the valet, Isabella sat in the car, and the jacket that had protected her felt sacred. She could hear the faint swell of the ballroom through the closed windows, the distant clink of silverware and low debate. Her brothers were inside. Aiden's fingers were steady at the edge of the door when he leaned in. He smelled like wood smoke and something solvent, tools, perhaps, from the kind of life that had taught him to build rather than destroy. "Are you hurt?" he asked, as much of a check on the physically possible injuries as on the invisible ones. "No," she lied, because sometimes a no was the first step toward a truer story. She needed to believe she was not broken. She needed to keep believing so that the child inside her could continue to trust the world. "And the baby?" Grayson's voice came from the shadowed doorway, where he lingered like a sentinel. His attention was already moving, cataloging what resources and what form of legal architecture they would need. "You didn't feel any sudden pain? Did you call your physician? Any contractions?" "Only the cold," Isabella said. The small admission seemed huge under the car's light, a travel-sized comfort, but a kind of evidence of her endurance. Grayson noted it with the clinical calm of someone who would later write it all down: times, sensations, medications. Miles was already on the phone, his voice low and sharp. He spoke to reporters like a man who had rehearsed restraint. He offered a statement that had been written not to inflame, but to define parameters. "We're coordinating to make sure she gets support," he said. "We're not interested in spectacle. We're interested in the truth being known and in her safety being assured." Aiden wrapped a protective arm around the small of her back and pulled the jacket up to her chin. "You should come home with us."
It was both a shelter and an invitation. The offer came with unspoken promises. Lawyers in waiting, medical appointments scheduled, nights when she'd have someone in the next room. It promised belonging in a way she had not allowed herself to receive for years. Isabella thought of the decision that had once led her away from her brother's table. She had wanted to be the architect of her own life. Independence had its delicious liberty. One learns to enjoy tea at midnight and the quiet sort of triumph of a bill paid alone. But the price of that independence, she now saw, had been the subtle erosion of a safety net that family sometimes is. There are moments when choosing to be alone is noble, and others when it is dangerous. Tonight felt like one of those times. Inside the ballroom, the conversation had taken new shapes. Some guests whispered about propriety and modern cruelty. Others looked away because collusion with a popular man had felt safer than the complications of public conscience. People in the room began recording the Harringtons' movements with a different intent now, the gestures of three men enacting protection rather than an audience consuming scandal. Marcus found himself increasingly isolated by the simplest human measure. Nobody wanted to be near the man who had just performed a cruelty. Allies stepped back in an effort that felt embarrassingly similar to disavowal. Men who had once sat in his company found reasons to be elsewhere. He paced the room like a caged idea, trying to reclaim the narrative by offering explanations that fell apart under the weight of documents and digital timestamps. He claimed misunderstandings, misread contexts. Scarlett attempted to perform outrage on his behalf, but the rehearsed edge of her voice failed to hold the room's attention. The channels Marcus had used to command attention, friends, honors, the gentle deformation of charm into credibility, had been severed by a newer, louder instrument, transparency that was now amplified by the Harringtons' reach. At the bar, a man who had been laughing at the spectacle took out his phone and scrolled through the feed until he found his own face in the background of a clip. He watched himself laughing at a woman's expense and felt, for the first time that night, the small, domestic horror of complicity. He locked the phone and left without taking his coat. In the hotel corridor, staff whispered to each other like witnesses at a scene. The manager, a woman with a name badge pinched to her suit, realized that tonight the hotel's reputation was entangled with a story she had not endorsed. She made a call to security and later to corporate, but by then the room had been mapped by millions and the consequences were no longer local. Marcus's live, brash performance had exposed cracks in other people's certainties, and those cracks had been big enough to let light through.
It is one thing to be remorseless when nobody knows. It is another thing to be unapologetic when the world is watching, and the world carries with it the instruments of consequence: screens, reporters, legal minds with patient tongues. Isabella felt the small, powerful elation of not being alone. It was quiet, and not quite the same as happiness. It was a steadiness that allowed her to breathe without the weight of spectacle crushing the breath out of her. She started to feel a template form in her chest for what the next days might look like. Medical appointments, the company's lawyers sitting at a table with Aiden and Grayson, Miles drafting press releases that would not twist her words. She imagined, carefully, a small life for the three of them, where support and love threaded like steady lines through uncertain days. But there was also the knowledge that nothing would fix overnight. The punch, the video splinter, the way her dignity had been used as a prop, those were not things that lawyers could simply put back into boxes. The consequences would need labor, legal and emotional, each requiring time and patience, the way real healing always does. As the brothers moved through the crowd, setting up contacts, taking notes, buffering who touched whom, who had witnessed what, Isabella sat quietly and let them do the heavy work. She watched Marcus in the distance, no longer the man she had loved, but someone unmasked. The distance between them felt like a public chasm now. The private edifice had collapsed under the force of exposure and witnesses. Back in the car, Grayson slid a quickly written card across to a number he said to keep close, an investigator they had used before, someone who could trace wires and follow money with surgical precision. He read bits aloud, like one rehearsing for a trial that might never come but should, in any case, be prepared for. Each factual morsel he placed near the story was another brick for the house he was building, a house that might shelter Isabella, legally and publicly. Miles, in the driver's seat of power even when he wasn't driving, had already arranged for a secure feed to be released to vetted journalists. He negotiated tone and timelines with the same art with which he had once negotiated a brand endorsement. His voice was level and unyielding. The brothers had the resources. They had the motive that did not smell of vengeance but of protection, and they had the muscle of influence, which, in a world that values attention, was often indistinguishable from power. Yet even as they began to move, there were limits. Grayson was careful, too careful to make promises as if he could buy justice. It will take time, he reminded both Isabella and himself. Investigation, filings, possible disciplinary processes. We can launch them, we can't write the calendar. Aiden put his hand on her knee, thumb turning small, patient circles. We're not going to let this be your story alone, he said.
We will put the world on record. We will do it with lawyers, with journalists who check their facts, with people who will not twist what happened to you. She let the words sink in. They had the cadence of a plan. It was not a resolution, but it was the beginning of a response. That was enough for now. Inside the hotel, Marcus paced and drank and called people who either did not pick up or did not want to answer. Scarlett texted allies with an urgency that smelled like the end of a lucrative arrangement. The scene had been dramatic, but the damage might be calculable. Bills, reputations, and partnerships looked different under the light of transparency. Outside, the city had started to hum with a new friction. People in far-flung places watched the clip loop and wondered about the justice of exposure. Social media curated reactions like a scoreboard, some entries sympathetic, others cruel. An undercurrent started to form, conversations about complicity and about the way public performance can be weaponized. The comments grew into threads that would later be quoted in op-eds. The buzz would become a pulse. Sophie, back at her apartment later that night, watched the replay and felt both relief and a tremor of fear. She had been the catalyst. She had thrown the match. She wondered, with the small guilt of an instigator, whether she had brought an end or merely escalated the beginning. But then she thought of Isabella's hand on her belly and the jacket Aiden had draped over her shoulders, and she felt sure that she had done the right thing. The brothers did not sleep much that night. Strategy meetings muttered in hushed tones around tables where coffee cooled. Legal counsel gave provisional lists. Miles curated a list of journalists to approach, not for salacious coverage, but for rigorous reporting. Grayson sat up late, pouring documents into folders, his mechanical mind finding comfort in the order. Aiden paced, then called their mother, then stopped, then called again. They were not gods. They were brothers learning how to direct the behavior of institutions they had access to. At 3 a.m, as the city slept and the first wave of public commentary had crashed against domestic walls, Isabella lay in a spare room in the Harrington house and remembered the coffee shop again. The rain, the joke, the promise. She thought of all the small acts that led her here, the trusting look, the shared bills, the patience with a man who could not be trusted. She thought of the child inside her and felt suddenly the shape of a future she had not yet named. There was no neat satisfaction in the knowledge that the brothers had arrived. There was only the work ahead, filings to file, interviews to manage, medical checks to keep. But as dawn threaded itself through the curtains and the house began to stir, Isabella felt something approach that was not spectacle, but steadiness. It was an arc as clean as a new paper sheet. Messy, yes, but usable.
The title of the night, of the incident that would travel, was not, she realized, about the shame itself, but about what followed it. When the world had first seen Marcus lift that bowl, they had tuned in for a moment of scandal. What they would now watch unfold, day by day, was the difficult, deliberate work of a family choosing to be more powerful than public humiliation. The brothers had arrived not to enact a private vengeance, but to assemble a public answer that relied on press, evidence, and the slow machinery of accountability. And yet, as the morning light grew, as text messages multiplied with offers and advisors and reporters seeking comment, the sense of climax had not come. The night had been a rupture. The aftermath was only beginning. There were many small, strategic moves to be made, steps that would determine whether Marcus's fall would be swift or staggered, whether Scarlett's culpability would be curtailed by professional processes, whether the public's compassion would translate into something more durable than a common thread. Isabella closed her eyes and, for the first time in a long while, let herself consider a future where the child she carried would be known by people who loved her because of relationships, not publicity. That thought, fragile as it was, warmed like the Harrington jacket still folded on the chair. It felt like belonging. Outside the house, somewhere between the shrill chorus of headlines and the quiet rooms where lawyers convened, the story unfolded in ways that could not yet be predicted. But there was one certain thing. The night had changed course the moment Marcus chose spectacle over privacy. In its wake, 3 brothers had walked through the doors, and the trajectory of a life had been redirected. The rest, as ever, would be work. The rest, as ever, would be work.
If this is hitting home for you, tell us where you're watching from. Just one small way to let the world know this kind of cruelty still matters. They moved like people who understood that publicity without proof was theater. Proof without publicity was silence. For 2 days, the Harringtons ran a tight perimeter around Isabella's life. Aidan handled the immediate: doctors, a private obstetrician on call, nights where he sat awake and cataloged every small sound from the next room. He became a human presence whose simplest gestures, coffee warm against the back of a hand, a jacket folded over the armchair, repaired more than advice ever could. He insisted on routines: blood pressure checks, phone calls with the physician, a schedule for rest that felt boring and therefore holy. Grayson built the scaffolding. He had already turned over the initial folder of documents to a lawyer who specialized in white-collar investigations. Within hours, they had identified patterns that looked like smoke: shell entities, rotating invoices, consulting contracts that paid for nothing.
He traced money through jurisdictions and time zones where names dissolved into corporate rectangles. He sent secure links to prosecutors' inboxes, less as supplication than as an inventory of things that needed looking at. Make a record, he told legal counsel again and again. Make it all auditable. Miles did what Miles did. He turned attention into a lever. He did not scream into the void, he curated. He gave vetted journalists timed access to facts and made sure the narrative could not be recast as gossip. He arranged for an investigative piece to run that would not sensationalize the punch but illuminate the pattern. He phoned a handful of boards and said plainly that they could sever ties quietly or face being named in a public report that would not be gentle. Contracts were suspended. A luxury brand withdrew a scheduled campaign. A corporate partner put a temporary hold on an investment round. None of these moves were theatrical. They were business decisions rushed by the calculus of reputational risk. But in this world, risk could be translated into consequence. Days lengthened into a steady, procedural rhythm. The hotel's board met with counsel. The socialite friends who had laughed now scrubbed their feeds and offered tepid sympathy. In back offices and secure rooms, men and women with badges read the documents Grayson had supplied and began to outline the kind of warrants that could follow paper trails. There were whispers about federal interest. There were careful notes about bigamy in another state, about transfers that suggested fraud. No one promised a quick end. Everyone prepared for a slow, careful unspooling. Marcus, when he was not pacing, made the sort of small, frantic calls men make when the architecture of their reputation is undercut. He contacted PR people who typically polished images for CEOs. He left a string of voicemails that grew shorter and sharper. He tried to enlist mediators and conservative friends, and when those calls met polite redirection, his language hardened. He began to look like someone whose scripts had been burned. Scarlett's phone lit up with messages from colleagues who were suddenly curious about the fingerprints on a case file she had once edited. Her law firm, contacted quietly by a reporter, opened a review. A complaint was lodged with the bar, a matter now public enough that a senior partner advised immediate suspension pending an ethics investigation. It was a professional erosion measured in board minutes and human resources memos. On the fourth day, the world tightened into a moment the brothers had anticipated. The FBI, having reviewed the material and procured the necessary approvals, executed a search warrant on a business address connected to Marcus. Agents did not burst in theatrically. They arrived precise, uniformed rhythm and the sort of efficiency that steals headlines from melodrama. Computers were cloned, files were cataloged, evidence left the premises in sealed boxes. Marcus was served notice as an individual under investigation. Later that afternoon, after officers knocked on the door of his apartment, he was led away in handcuffs. The image, when it ran, was not punitive in its presentation. It was clinical. Charges were described in press statements as being pursued and under investigation, and both Miles and Grayson took care to speak only in facts they could document. People watched the images loop and felt what the Harringtons felt. The public pendulum had swung from spectacle toward process. The viral clip that had once reduced a woman to a punchline now became an exhibit in a wider inquiry. Marcus's bank accounts were flagged. Investments paused. A luxury developer publicly announced it would distance itself while compliance reviews were underway. Scarlett received a notice of suspension from her firm pending bar review. The public ledger of reputational capital had a missing entry where her career had been. Isabella spent much of this time in the small orbit of the house. Mornings in blue light with Aidan making tea, afternoons where Grayson would sit beside her and explain, in a tone that betrayed his fear with precise calm, what might happen next.
Evenings when Miles came home late and unlatched his phone to show her the exact headlines he had authorized. She did not try to read everything. Reading was a risk of reopening wounds. Instead, she concentrated on the motion of knitting together days, prenatal vitamins, brief walks in the garden, the way a glass of orange juice tasted sweeter after the shock of joy. Grief arrived in small, odd shapes. Sometimes it was a lullaby Marcus had sung years earlier, a song that seemed to belong to a private geography of trust. Sometimes it was the sudden recognition that she had missed little moments she would now never get back, a joint purchase she had postponed, a holiday dinner she had imagined and shelved. She grieved the idea of a partnership that had been a fiction, and the work of disentanglement that felt as domestic as changing a light bulb and as monumental as assigning blame in court. A midwife from the Harrington Clinic came, and Dr. Chen, Isabella's friend, sat in on appointments. They discussed birth plans with a careful optimism. "This is about making choices that protect you and the baby," the midwife said once, voice steady and not theatrical. "You're doing the right things now." Those words, small and procedural, steadied her. There were also nights when the house filled with other people, investigators, doctors, friends who brought food that smelled of time and slow reconciling. People came with shoes off and stayed for too long. They did not come to stare, they came to tether. A neighbor later said the Harrington house had the quality of a place where stitches were being replaced, deliberate, attentive repair.
When the initial shock quieted enough for long-form thinking, Gabriel, a private investigator Grayson had contracted, called with a ledger he had constructed. He spoke like a man who loved puzzles. "There's a gap here," he said. "This transfer was routed through an LLC that dissolved in 2016. It reappears in 2019 with different signatories. We've got people on the ground who can pull telephone records and meeting logs." Grayson set his jaw. "Do it," he said. "Everything." The world outside continued to murmur. Columnists debated motives. Social feeds erupted with compassion, condemnation, and the occasional cynical joke. But beneath the motley of voices, a smaller movement moved. People offering to testify, employees stepping forward with documents, former associates who felt suddenly empowered to speak. What had been private suddenly had a public gravity that slowly pressed into the legal posture. Marcus's arraignment was described later in the paper as a man who had once traded flattering narratives for trust. The charges, as listed publicly, were framed in the court's language: allegations of fraud, allegations of misrepresentation, related counts that prosecutors said they planned to review. The narrative of spectacle had become an administrative fact. Scarlett volunteered for a suspension hearing. Later, with the bar's disciplinary process unfolding, she tendered a formal resignation from her most visible partnerships. Her law license would face review. The hits were not instantaneous obliteration. Legal processes move with slowness to ensure fairness, but the arc was unmistakable. Professional consequence followed exposure. During the weeks that followed, Isabella's recovery became a set of small reparative acts. She took part in counseling, though at first the sessions felt like someone cleaning a wound with cold hands, necessary and uncomfortable. She learned to say, in small ways, what she had been ashamed to hold aloud. She learned how to answer questions without becoming the story. "I am doing okay," she said to a journalist once, choosing each word as someone might choose stones to lay a path. It was not a false hope, it was a claim. Sophie remained in the periphery, a constant who had lit the match and now stood properly beside the person who had asked for help. She and Isabella would sometimes sit in the sunroom and talk about small things: the color of baby blankets, the absurdity of celebrity baby names. These conversations were islands where the rest could be momentarily ignored. There are moments of public friction. A defense attorney attempted to portray Marcus as a man misunderstood. Old friends, those who had once laughed with him, appeared in op-eds invoking complexity. The internet, with its will to nuance and its appetite for scandal, produced counter-narratives. The Harringtons met these with documents and patient insistence on facts. They didn't need to shout, they needed to keep the record clear. Months passed. The pregnancy carried on with the measured, ordinary miracle of it. Appointments came and went. The fear of losing the child was a constant, small and jagged, but the prenatal team was meticulous. Aidan insisted on a birthing plan that included a vetted pediatrician, a secure delivery room, and a roster of people allowed in the suite. He was, in ways he had never been before, exact about tenderness. On a late autumn morning, the world narrowed to a hospital corridor. Rain freckled the windows. Isabella clutched Aidan's hand with a strength that belonged to someone who had learned endurance as a craft. Grayson sat with his head bent over notes, an unreadable calm about him. Miles, who had been quieter in the weeks before, hovered like a man carrying a lantern, alert but gentle. Labor was long enough to be real and not long enough to leave room for fear. She labored with a midwife who had seen miracles that felt small and sacred. Aiden whispered stories about their childhood, how he had once built a cardboard castle for her and how she declared it the greatest fortress she'd ever seen. "You always loved a good story," he said, and she laughed through a contraction. When the baby came, it came with a sound that erased a night. He cried with the clear, indignant authority of someone lodging a claim on the world. Aiden, Grayson, and Miles each leaned in, their faces softened by long wakefulness. Miles, who rarely let the camera record family without permission, put his hands flat on the hospital bed and simply said, "Welcome." Isabella held the child and watched him as if cataloging constellations. His fingers puckered around her thumb. The room smelled like baby shampoo and coffee and antiseptic. There were no headlines in that place, only the shuffling of nurses and a man whose life had been reorganized by love. The press release the Harringtons issued later that day was unadorned. It thanked the medical team. It asked for privacy. It made clear that while the legal process would continue, the family's priority was the child's well-being. People who followed the story for months felt briefly a release of breath. In the months that followed, Isabella rebuilt around the new axis of motherhood. She took small steps, a class on infant first aid, quiet afternoons in the garden, tentatively renewed friendships. She allowed herself to be seen only on her terms. Legal matters continued. The office that handled Marcus's affairs negotiated settlements with creditors, prosecutors filed motions, and auditors continued to comb through ledgers. Scarlett's professional path narrowed. Committees convened, letters were written, and the bar ultimately moved toward disbarment proceedings that was last in public for months. Marcus faced potential indictments that eventually led, in the story's last public chapter, to a conviction on select counts, an outcome that in the script of this family felt more like an accounting than catharsis.
What the Harringtons had done was not vengeance, it was leverage, channeled through institutions that could enforce consequence. Journalists who vetted facts, lawyers who filed motions, regulators who opened reviews. Power was applied to make a process move. The brothers had the means to make the world look and to insist that the world keep looking until what had been hidden was visible. They had not been perfect, they had not erased pain, but they had created a corridor for accountability. At home, the baby's presence knitted small domestic cords into a life that had been jagged. Isabella learned to find humor again in the mundane, the ridiculousness of socks that never matched, the astonishment at how little sleep could still be survived with coffee and love. Her relationship with her brothers shifted from an axis of dependency to a more complex map of mutual care. It was not that the past was forgotten, it was that a new present had been defined. Months became a year. The anniversary of the party was noted privately, a thin line on a calendar that once mattered too much. Marcus's name still appeared in legal filings and in a few late op-eds, but for Isabella it had the weight of a chapter read and closed. Scarlett's professional reverberations continued. She changed careers, her public profile diminished, and she,